Hey guys, how is it going? A long time no see, as usual. So, let me just give out fine points. So it seems we have a new recipient, Svezhiepiatki. First 500 pine points for you. Congratulations. If you don't know what this is for, ask around. So apparently there's been some internet drama between Paulogia and some apologists, specifically about the appearance of Jesus to the 500 brethren in the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed. So for people who don't know what we are going to be talking about, here's the passage, right? So in 1 Corinthians 15, there's a pre-Pauline material, very probably, where Paul talks about something that he received from some other people. And that's basically a summary of what Christians believe about Jesus, his burial, death, burial, and resurrection. And then there is a list of people that Jesus supposedly appeared to. The order is Cephas, then the 12, then James, and then all of the apostles. That's what was in the creed, and what Paul inserted, very probably, is then he was seen by more than 500 brethren, brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Why do you think that this was not a part of the original creed? That this was something that Paul added later? Well, it's because the creed has a certain structure, poetic structure, and this is one of the places where the structure is disrupted, which suggests that it wasn't a part of the original creed. We don't know where that creed came from, and don't let people tell you otherwise, right? Paul never says who he got this information from. There are some candidates. We know that he met with so-called Jerusalem pillars, so people who were probably in charge of the church in Jerusalem, Cephas or Cephas, John and James. But he doesn't say that this is where he got this information from. And we, of course, don't know when the creed was formulated, but Paul says that this is something, in the letter, Paul says that this is something that he's reminding to the church of Corinthians, to the church in Corinth. And this is something that he apparently already told them when he was in Corinth in person, which means that the creed at least is older than his visit to Corinth, because he got it before he went to Corinth, then he went to Corinth, he told it to the Corinthians, and then later, we don't know how many years later, how much time has elapsed since then, he wrote them a letter where he's reminding them that this had already told them. That's pretty much what we know, right? And the YouTube drama was about the appearance specifically to the 500 people. I have to say that I haven't actually watched any of the videos involved because I have a life. But I'm just familiar with the controversy through osmosis, sort of, right? And also because people ask me about, what I think about this kinds of stuff. And basically, I'm here to tell you that the entire drama is completely unnecessary and it can be very easily avoided. And the reason why I decided to talk about it is because it's a perfect opportunity for me to show a principle that I apply when I talk about the resurrection. Because people sometimes criticize me, non Christians specifically, criticize me that when I talk about the resurrection, I grant too many things for the sake of argument. And then in the discussion, it doesn't look good because I'm essentially legitimizing the things that I'm granting for the sake of argument, even though they are obviously not what I believe, right? I'm just granting them so that the conversation can actually progress. But then, if you are an outsider and you don't know, what's going on, you might get an impression that I'm actually conceding those points, that I'm actually agreeing with my conversational partner about those things that I'm granting for the sake of argument being the case. And, that's a fair critique. There isn't really anything that I can do about it. The only thing that I want to be really careful when I do that is to signalize very carefully and very clearly that I'm just granting it for the sake of argument, and that's not something that I honestly believe. So the question is, if there is this legitimate criticism, why am I doing this? Well, in order to avoid situations like what we've been experiencing for the past couple of weeks now, maybe, with this YouTube drama, right? Because there is value in granting things for the sake of argument because it allows you to skip irrelevant points and to really laser focus on the questions that are important. And I think atheists are very often doing a mistake of not conceding some of the points. Very often, the conversation between Christian and non-Christian start is like this, right? A Christian makes a claim, which is supposed to be a first step in a very long series of claims, inferences, arguments, and so on, that ultimately get to a proposition, which is something like, there is a God, or Jesus was raised from the dead, something like that, right? And what an atheist does is the moment that the Christian opens their mouth, they immediately jump uh, and they start essentially a refutation, right? You can see it very clearly, for example, if you watch The Atheist Experience, where it's really difficult. I feel, I empathize with the theist scholars, and I feel it's sometimes very difficult for them to communicate very clearly what they want to say. And now, of course, the host can always say that they want to prevent the Christian from just rambling for 10 minutes. But that's a double-edged sword, right? Like if you are this strict about the callers being very succinct and to the point, you run into a risk of not giving them the opportunity to really tell you what they have in mind. So yeah, I'm a big fan of granting things for the sake of argument. One of the things that I'm granting things for the sake of I'm granting for the sake of argument when I'm discussing the resurrection is specifically that if we had a time machine, we could actually travel to the first century and we could identify specific people that the passage in 1 Corinthians 15 is actually talking about. So we could find people who, if we show them the passage, they would be able to say, yeah, this is actually talking about me, right? Now, of course, I'm talking hypothetically. Like there would be no way for us to actually identify who those people are because we don't have any names. We don't know where they live. But hypothetically, in principle, we would be able to do it. More specifically, granting for the sake of argument that it's not the case that there were no people like that, and that the information in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed is in the creed for some reason other than there actually being a group of people that the text describes, right? For example, because someone invented it, it's just a false information, right? And as far as I know, I don't think Paulogia would adopt the same position, right? I don't actually know what his position about historicity of the 500 Brethren is. I just, in a very brief preparation for this stream, watched his short video where he essentially sketches his hypothesis, which explains the resurrection evidence. I know that on his hypothesis, he thinks there were probably only two people who had post-bereavement hallucinations, Peter and maybe John. And then he explains Paul, I think, as, if I have that correctly, guilt-induced psychotic breakdown, something like that. I don't know anything about psychology, so, and I mean, I am assuming that Paul is like better informed because he has people who are actually trained in psychology around him. So okay, seems legit, but he doesn't really say anything about, for example, the 500 brethren. So I don't know if he thinks that there might have been some people like that the passage is actually talking about. I don't know whether he thinks that there were no people like that, and the reason why it says Jesus appeared to 500 is because this is essentially false information that got into the text somehow, right? And if he thinks there were actually people that the passage is talking about, I don't know what he would say about the nature of the experience. And there are several routes that you can take when you explain that. One way is to say, for example, that it was a Pentecostal-like experience, that people were just essentially experiencing very strong emotions. They were overcome by emotions, and they chose specific terminology to express it. And the terminology was that they saw the risen Jesus, right? It's actually really interesting because if you look at the passage again, it obviously doesn't have any details. It doesn't give any names, doesn't give any places, it doesn't date the experience, but also it doesn't say anything about what kind of experience it was. It doesn't say whether the people saw Jesus visually, whether what Jesus was doing, how he was looking, how he looked like, what kind of clothes that he was wearing, right? It doesn't say whether he said anything. It doesn't say anything about people touching him. It doesn't say anything about him touching objects, like interacting with his surroundings, anything like that, right? All of that is pretty much open. There is only one thing that it says, and that's the verb which is used, which is horao, which means to see. Now, obviously, Greeks in verbs in Greek have a usually very wide range of meaning. So a word can mean all kinds of different things, right? And it's definitely true that horao is used just for sight. It's something that you see with your eyes, but it can mean all kinds of other things. It can, for example, even mean activity that is entirely internal, that it just happens in your mind, right? For example, Philo of Alexandria uses the same verb with this kind of meaning. So I think horao in this context doesn't necessarily have to mean that 500 people were all looking in one direction at something that like multiple people could see at the same time. And if there happened to be someone just walking past the group, like one of the people from the group could pull him in, show him the thing, and that person would see it as well, right? That could be the case. That could be what's meant by that specific verb in that context, but it doesn't have to necessarily mean that. It can also just mean a very strong emotional experience that a large group of believers had in some kind of religious setting, right? So I don't actually know how Paulogia is explaining it, but I just want to say that obviously what apologists are, and the reason why they bring this up and why this is important is because it's the creed is pretty early, so like on paper it checks a lot of the boxes for historical reliability of written material better than some other texts, for example the Gospels, which were written later, and also it's an experience to a group. So if you ever listen to a debate or a presentation, an apologist is going to say something like, and you can, because obviously apologists are stealing material from each other, right? Like literally word for word, you will hear them say something like, of course, hallucinations, for example, are internal, right? They are private to the individual. They just happen in your mind, and you cannot share them with other people. The same with dreams, right? Mike Lacona and several other people who probably have it from him has this anecdote or this illustration where he says, if I wake my wife in the middle of the night, I can't just tell her, look, honey, I'm having this amazing dream. Why don't you join me in my dream and we are going to have this amazing dream together, right? I have a dream that I'm in Hawaii. Why don't you join me and we are going to have a free vacation? And obviously the point of the illustration is that experiences like hallucinations and dreams are only private to the mind of individuals and we cannot share them, right? Which supposedly makes these group appearances more difficult to explain, precisely because a non-Christian cannot appeal to the kinds of psychological phenomena that are only private to the mind of individuals. They have to come up with a different explanation. And Christian apologists will very often claim that either, and that's the weaker version of the claim, nobody has ever came up with such explanation, or a stronger version of that claim is that no such explanation actually exists, that there isn't anything in reality that multiple people can see at the same time and be like honestly mistaken that they are experiencing seeing the risen Jesus, right? And I'm actually here to tell you that that's not the case, right? So I'm just granting for the sake of argument And this is something that maybe Paulogia can consider as well, just granting for the sake of argument, that if we had a time machine, we could, in principle, even though we don't actually have any information to do that, but we could at least in principle, like if we surveyed all of the people in the ancient world, find more or less 500 people that, could say, yeah, this is actually talking about me. Like, I believe I was into the group, and I think we all saw the risen Jesus. And you would find, about 500 people who would say that. Now, do I honestly believe that? Of course not. I'm just granting it for the sake of argument. Why don't I believe that? Well, because I think we have no way of knowing, right? Like we don't know like why that information is in the creed, and we can't go back in time to check. So I think we'll probably never know. But let's just grant it for the sake of argument, which means that the entire conversation between Paulogia and I think his name is Andrew Loke, and Cameron Bertuzzi could have been entirely avoided, right? Because that's just like a completely redundant information to have. That would be that's kind of similar to what I often see is that an apologist is trying to make a case for the resurrection, and then a non-Christian objects the first moment they have the opportunity, and then there is a 10-hour discussion about the Kalam cosmological argument, which is something where God doesn't even feature in the conclusion. So sometimes it's just better to grant things for the sake of argument, to see where the conversation goes, and really like pick your battles, pick your fights, and focus on the really important parts, right? So, okay, we're granting for the sake of argument, and we could really find 500 people that the creed is talking about. How can we explain that? Well, this is what the rest of this theme is going to be about, right? And it's of course very important to realize what exactly we are explaining. So first of all, we are not explaining the conversion of Paul. We are only explaining the conversion of people who are mentioned in the creed. So Paul is appending his own conversion experience to the creed. It wasn't originally in it, and it could very easily be the case that the nature of Paul's experience was different than experience of the people in the creed, and that happens all the time, right? Like every year there are conventions of alien abductees who share their stories about how they were abducted. And what's very often the case is that the nature of their experience is going to be very difficult. It is going to be very different from one another, right? And the details are going to be very different. They are even going to be contradictory. Some people think they were abducted by reptilians who told them that they are on a mission of galactic peace. Some people believe that they were abducted by gray aliens who are there to create a race of hybrids between people and aliens and take over the world, right? Through a black oil. And that attendees, like this differences, these discrepancies in the way the experience actually took place, are not going to convince anyone in attendance that they were not abducted by aliens, right? This is, by the way, a point that Gary Habermas makes, and I think it's really silly. He basically says, look, Paul and Peter met, and so, here we have two people at least, that Jesus apparently, appeared to both. And they could just compare notes, essentially. They could ask each other, how did Jesus look like? What was he wearing? What was the color of his eyes? And if they found out that the details don't match, this would cause them to doubt the veracity of the experience, right? But of course, this is not how people work, right? This is not how religions work, and this is not just how people work in general, right? Like this never stopped anyone from being a sincere believer in anything, and if it does, it's probably very rare. So we are only really explaining the appearance to the people in the creed. We are not explaining the contents of the Gospels. I think there is a different explanation, and I'm going to be the first person to admit that what I'm going to be presenting here would obviously not explain the contents of the Gospels. It's actually, if you start with the assumption that with a time machine, you would be able to find people in the first century who really believed that Jesus was teaching them for 40 years after his resurrection, if you start with that assumption, it's going to be super easy for you to find a naturalistic explanation, right? Um, and again, if you start with an assumption that there really were people in the first century who sincerely believed that they experienced Jesus eating a piece of fish in the same room with like 10 other people who all also saw Jesus eating a piece of fish, and that Jesus was talking to them. He allowed people to put fingers in his wounds and stuff like that. And if you start with that assumption, it's going to be super difficult to come up with a naturalistic explanations for that, right? Because of course people don't experience things like that, especially not in group settings, right? The dream is not going to explain that. A hallucination is not going to explain that, right? I'm again, I don't know anything about psychology, but probably other kinds of psychological phenomena are probably not going to explain that, be able to explain that. Maybe James Further would be able to cook up an explanation like that, because I think he's more open to the kinds of experiences that are described in the Gospels and in Acts to be like what people sincerely believed. So he's more open to the idea that there actually were people who were convinced that they really experienced the things that are described in the Gospels. But and he appeals to like memory distortions and the way how memory alters over time and stuff like that. Again, I don't know anything about that. He's definitely much more qualified, right? Given that he's, I think, studying neuropsychology, something like that, neuroscience. But the way, obviously, how anyone would explain the contents of the Gospels and Acts is that these scenes, these scenarios of Jesus appearing to groups of people in closed rooms, eating, talking to them, teaching them, breaking bread with them, and stuff like that, are obviously original creations, either of gospel authors or of their sources. And they actually don't track with anything that happened in first century Palestine, right? So the explanation is not there is some kind of phenomena that then caused people to sincerely believe that they broke bread with Jesus on the way and in Emmaus. It's just story, right? And somehow it got into the Gospels. At some point, someone invented it. So that's an obvious explanation, right? And what you will very often see from apologists is basically employing what's called, I think it was termed by Robert Price, the yellow brick road apologetics, which is just the idea that if you can't explain, if the Emerald City doesn't exist, you can't explain where the yellow brick road leads. So in this analogy, if Jesus wasn't raised, you can't explain why is it the case that 12 people in a closed room saw Jesus, talked to Jesus, touched Jesus, and he ate food that they had, right? Yeah, like if that actually happened, that would be super, super difficult. If there actually were people who would be, who are sincerely convinced that this is something that they experience, it would be super difficult to explain. But an obvious, I think, very plausible explanation is that there were no people like that. And the reason why this is narrated in the Gospels is a different reason other than there actually were people who experienced that, who were sincerely convinced that they experienced it, right? I have an explanation of like why exactly was it invented, what were the circumstances for that, what was the reasoning, the motivation behind it. But that's a theme for another video, right? So it's super important to realize that we are just explaining the content of the creed. We are not explaining anything else. And we should be very careful about not importing, for example, the contents into the Gospels back into the Pauline letters, right? So very often, I think it's almost always the case that when Christians are reading 1 Corinthians 15 and it says he appeared to Cephas, they immediately assume that this is talking about one of the appearances that's narrated in the Gospels, because of course Christians harmonize, right, different sources. So they imagine when they read 1 Corinthians 15 the content of the Gospels. But we have to be very careful and just work with the information which is in the creed. Because for why those narratives are in the Gospels, there are going to be different explanations, which is perfectly fine, right? So let's go. Are you excited? All right. So we are granting, for the sake of argument, that there were 500 people that we could in principle find in the first century would be able to say truthfully, sincerely, that they are convinced that they saw the risen Jesus together with a large group of early Christians, about 500, right? Give or take. So what can explain it? So obviously we are looking for something that has external existence that multiple people can see at the same time, and they can observe it for an extended period of time, and it has a potential of forming their beliefs, more specifically their religious beliefs, right? And what I'm asserting as an explanation is pareidolia, which is just a human tendency to incorrectly perceive a stimulus as a meaningful pattern. Happens all the time. It's a very strong tendency that people have. The reason why we have it is because we are pattern-seeking mammals, and this is just is it type 1 or type 3 error? It's basically more advantageous for an individual to be oversensitive in pattern detection than undersensitive, right? So obviously, you're not going to be infallible. You're not going to be 100% correct all the time when you're identifying patterns in nature. And you can fail in one or two ways. Either you can fail to identify a pattern that's there, or you can fail to, or you can identify a pattern when it's in fact not there. And it's of course more advantageous to do the second type of error more often, because if you do the first type of error, you're probably going to be killed by a predator, right? Because you failed to identify the pattern that signalizes that a predator is there. And this is obviously very well documented, not just in people, but also in animals. It's more advantageous for a bird to fly away when it hears a noise, even though the noise isn't actually a cat, for example, because a bird that's just going to be hanging around when there's a noise will probably get eaten much more often, right? So this is just the reasoning for it, and of course, us being very complex, creative mammals, it has all kinds of interesting applications. It has religious applications, so pareidolia happens all the time in religious traditions. Instances of pareidolia become very valued possessions. They become very, for example, they become centers of worship. So entire churches and temples are built around them. They become pilgrimage sites, for example. People go there and visit. And really, it takes less than 30 seconds of Googling to find many, many examples of believers of multiple religions using what is very clear an instance of pareidolia to boost their confidence in what they already believe religiously. It's just something that people do very, very often. Is it reasonable? It's not reasonable. Does it happen all the time? It does, right? And it's very, very important is when we look for a hypothesis that explains the data, not to fall into a mistake of thinking that a belief which is unreasonable to believe is improbable to occur in people, right? So you might make a mistake of thinking, okay, this is really dumb, which means people are not going to believe it. That's not how people work, right? We see people forming irrational beliefs, specifically these kinds of beliefs, all the time. So super plausible, right? So how does pareidolia look like exactly? Well, probably the most famous example of pareidolia is this, right? Well, this is typical pareidolia. So it's some kind of stimulus. In this case, it's a shape of a rock on Mars, and people incorrectly perceive it as a meaningful pattern. In this case, as a face. And I'm sure you guys saw the same spot photographed under different conditions, and it's obvious that there is no face, right? This is just an optical illusion, essentially. But as we all know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, all of those other photos were faked by NASA that's trying to cover Martians existing. So this is a really typical example of pareidolia, right? So I think we can all see a face. I think people are much more receptive to observe specifically human shapes, human figures, and faces. Again, for all kinds of reasons that are obvious, right? It's beneficial for mammals to identify members of their own species. I'm sure it has to do something with how babies identify their offspring and stuff like that. Yeah, again, a really nice pareidolia. I'm sure we can all see it, right? In case you don't see it, just follow the shape of the cliff and the green. What is it? Is it moss or grass? It's going to look like hair. In some cases, I'm sure there are individual differences in recognition of pareidolia. Like there are some edge cases where I, for example, don't see it, and I'm sure that other people don't see it as well. But like different individuals are going to be much more susceptible to seeing what they perceived as a pattern in what's essentially just a random noise, right? But there are cases of pareidolia where essentially everyone can see it. This is a really nice example, right? Which has some religious connotation. I'm not sure this is going to convince anyone of any theological positions, but yeah, it's very obviously a bird. And I'm wondering whether this was intentional. Probably not, right? Maybe originally the church was painted differently, and then they chose different colors, so the contrast became larger and it's more obvious what's going on. And then we are getting to examples of real examples of pareidolia with religious significance that you can again very easily find believers who will sincerely and completely honestly point to this as like a significant feature of the world connected to their religious beliefs, right? So we will find no shortage, for example, of believers sharing these pictures on social media and either pointing to them as evidence that their specific theological beliefs are true, or something that boosts confidence in what they believe. So this is the so-called Jesus Nebula. It's not how it's called. I should have written down the actual name, but yeah, it just looks like praying Jesus, right? I don't know, like why he has stars in his head, in his brain, but there you go. How can you possibly explain that there is a nebula which looks like praying Jesus on naturalism? You can't. There's also a nebula that looks like Northern America, like the shape of Northern America. I think it's called American Nebula or something like that. You can look it up. It's super interesting. It's mostly the eastern coast. So there's like Florida and Texas and stuff like that. Yeah. Not really surprising that we would see things like that, given like how big the universe is and how much stuff we can observe now with really good precision, right? But there you go, Jesus. So this would be an example of pareidolia, which apparently became a not necessarily a place of worship, but obviously a place of like specific religious significance. I can imagine, given there are flowers, that people go to that specific tree as opposed to any random tree in the area more often. Maybe they pray there. Again, this could be something that boosts their existing religious beliefs, right? And it's just a shape on a tree. So apparently there are angels in the brain. Like, so everyone has a brain, has an angel in their brain. Maybe not everyone has a brain, but if you do have a brain, you've got an angel in it. It even looks like, and again, this could be something like that where people perceive it differently. So when I look at it, I clearly see that the angel is wearing a hood, and the hood kind of covers their forehead. And then there are obviously like two wings, right? So I don't know why you would expect human brain to look like an angel if you cut it like one specific way. But there you go. You know what? Actually, what's really good example of pareidolia, and I should have bring this up. So there is an apologist who really has a serious talk where the entire talk is just featured around one specific chemical which somehow features in like a human body very prominently. I don't know exactly what it does, but it's shaped like a cross. That's a typical example of pareidolia, right? And of course, the apologist has a very elaborate explanation for why this is significant on theism. Like he really needs to MacGyver and I think oversell the importance of that specific chemical for the human body, because it's not just any random chemical, right? It's something that's like the cornerstone of human existence and without which we wouldn't exist, and we absolutely need it, right? Again, I don't understand like biochemistry and human anatomy. Seems to me he's kind of overselling it, right? Because if it was just a random chemical, maybe people would be more likely to see that it's just a dumb coincidence, and that like if you have, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of chemicals in the human body, probably one of them is probably going to be randomly looking like a cross, right? And what's actually super interesting about that specific case is that if you actually show a picture of that chemical under a microscope, it is T-shaped, or it's shaped like a cross. But the thing is that it looks like a paper cross that you cut out of paper, and then you like smash it, right? So it doesn't look like a cross that you see on top of a church, right? It only looks that way in textbooks when they actually present like a schematic diagram of the molecule, because there it needs to be like very clearly drawn out, because that's more instructive, that's more didactic. But if you actually look at the chemical, it doesn't look like a cross, right? It just looks like a random chunk, which and then if you were able to manipulate the chemical, then you could get it to look like a cross. Yeah, that's a really nice example of pareidolia. This is a famous example. This is from Wikipedia, so apparently it was a big deal, right? So some kind of optical effect on windows. I was specifically looking for things that are not just like an artifact of photographic technology or camera technology. So this is supposedly how it looks like if you are seeing it from the naked eye, with the naked eye, right? Apparently. So when the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris very unfortunately burned down, some people claim that they saw figures in the flames. This is an example of pareidolia that I don't see personally, at least not in this picture. Maybe there are better pictures, but it was a big deal. I remember like media informing about it, right? And I'm sure that, if you found, for example, media articles about it, or if you found YouTube videos about it and you scroll down in the comment sections, I'm sure there are going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of comments by people who will be sincerely convinced that this is like significant and this fits into their religious worldview. This is not just a natural phenomena, but something supernatural is actually going on. And now we are getting more specifically to what I want to talk about, and that's Jesus-shaped cloud, right? So the kind of pareidolia that I'm proposing as an explanation for the appearances, the group appearance in 1 Corinthians 15 Creed is a Jesus-shaped cloud. So I'm just basically explaining it as a large group of early Christians was walking outside, and they suddenly saw a Jesus-shaped cloud. Cephas saw it first, then the 12. Then 500 people saw it at the same time. Then James saw it. He was always kind of slow, right? That's why, it took him so long to join Christianity, even though Jesus, his own brother, was walking on water, feeding thousands of people and stuff like that. And then all of the apostles saw it last, I guess. Here's one example like that. And by the way, I specifically, like for this section, I specifically, again, picked pictures, which I took from Christian sources, Christian websites, Christian media, where, this is specifically presented not as, look, there's a cloud that kind of looks like Jesus, isn't that kind of funny, right? This is always framed and presented specifically to as something that boosts the confidence of the people that are sharing it in their existing religious beliefs, right? So this isn't like, they don't perceive it as just a random fluke, as a natural phenomena. They don't perceive it as something that sometimes happens, right? Because clouds have all kinds of shapes. They are obviously, I would say, probably completely oblivious to what pareidolia is. So they wouldn't be definitely appreciating the kind of tricks that their mind is playing on them. Yeah, this is supposed to be Jesus with his arms stretched. I don't see it. But again, this is something that is circulating on the internet. And again, it just goes to show that there are individual differences in how receptive people are to this. There are people who are apparently oversensitive to seeing these kinds of patterns, even in just data where we wouldn't normally see any kind of pattern, right? There was actually one guy on YouTube, and his entire YouTube channel was just him seeing Jesus everywhere, essentially. Unfortunately, he deleted the YouTube channel, so the YouTube channel doesn't exist, which is super sad. I had it bookmarked, and I intended to use it in one of my streams as an illustration. I should have downloaded some videos, but unfortunately now the YouTube channel no longer exists, so you will just have to take my word for it. But it was basically a guy, and his key theological premise was that God is omnipresent. He's everywhere, which in his mind somehow translates to an expectation that he should, and people in general, should be able to find images of Jesus, I guess, specifically, in everywhere. And that's exactly what he did, right? He was able to find Jesus everywhere. For example, in logos of companies. So he would take a company logo, he would do some kind of manipulation with it, and lo and behold, there was something which in his mind looked like Jesus. More often than not, I didn't see it, but in some cases, yeah, it's amazing how creative people can be when they really set their mind to something, right? It's the same as numerology. Like some numerological works can actually be really impressive because yeah, if you are obsessed with numbers, then you will be able to come up with all kinds of crazy patterns. Like I know that I think in Hebrew, you can assign numbers to letters, and then the number for mother and number of father, if you add it together, you get the number for child, something like that, right? So, and again, numerology is kind of similar because again, it's a case of people being hypersensitive to pattern detection. But this is kind of similar just with optical stuff, you know. So unfortunately, we don't have that guy, but maybe he's going to start making videos again, or maybe there is someone other who's like that, who's really super oversensitive and religious about these kinds of. And imagine if Peter, was like that, then that would be super spicy. Because of course you can prime very easily people into these kinds of things, right? So I'm sure it's the case that if you took two different groups, one treatment group and one control group, and you showed the same picture to both groups, but in the treatment group you would tell them what to look for first, then they would be much more likely to see it, right? So you can actually prime people into seeing these kinds of patterns, especially if you are in a position of authority, especially if you already have a fucked up epistemology essentially, and if you already have all kinds of supernatural beliefs, right? Beliefs about the supernatural, I should say. So this is just the picture which I used for the thumbnail. I of course use it because it has a red circle, and the YouTube algorithm is such that if you have a red circle and even better a red arrow in your thumbnail, then you will go viral instantly, or at least you are more likely to. Yeah, again, this is super interesting, right? I can definitely see a Baroque statue in there. Not very difficult to see. Yeah, this is really interesting. This is that I can see very easily. I should have asked my wife about these. It would be really interesting to see how big of a difference there is even between two people. Because yeah, I can very easily see Jesus's face, for example. But I can imagine some people probably wouldn't be able to see it. And maybe the last illustration is this. So yeah, again, you can very clearly see a human figure. Now, is this completely ridiculous as an explanation? Of course it is. Do I think that's what actually happened? Of course not. Why don't I think that? Well, because we have no way of knowing, right? We don't have a time machine. We can go back in time. And the evidence that we have is insufficient to essentially say one way or the other. Now, do I think it's more probable than a resurrection, an ascension, plus Jesus' appearance? Yeah, I think it's probably is, right? At least as coach, at least a little bit. Now, if I ever present these arguments to a professional apologist, I am willing to bet $1,000 right now that this is what they are going to say. So I'm like now publicly betting $1,000 that this is what they will say. In the first debate that I will ever have with a professional full-time apologist, where I actually present this. And if that's not what happens, I'll just donate $1,000 to a church, a Protestant evangelical church in the US. They will say that my explanation is completely ad hoc because there is no evidence that this is what those people experienced. And if you ever talk about the resurrection, or now that I think about it, about theism in general, or not just theism actually, about all kinds of other things, this is what you are going to get all the time. So there is some kind of data that you're supposed to explain. The person that you are talking to has an explanation. And then when you present an alternative explanation, they are going to ask you for more evidence in favor of your explanation over theirs. Like I was recently talking with people who believe in NDEs. This is what they did as well. So doesn't necessarily have anything to do with God existing, right? It could be the case that NDEs are real and still there is no God, right? The world is spirit. But this is what they did. If that ever happens to you, here's what you need to say. And I think we can all recite it. Imagine there is a box. The box weighs 10 pounds. I say there's a lizard in the box. You say, wait a moment. How do you know there's a lizard in the box? There could be a duck in the box. After all, it's true that lizards weigh 10 pounds, but ducks also weigh 10 pounds. So the box weighing 10 pounds isn't evidence for a lizard, right? It could just be a duck. To which I say, well, do you have any evidence it's a duck? Do you hear the box quacking? You don't. So obviously there's a lizard in the box, not a duck. See how this is fucked up? You should see it immediately, right? Like with this example, super clear. But it's really, really interesting how people have difficulty grasping that when it comes to maybe some real world examples, right? So sure, this is just completely made up, right? And we have no way of knowing, and there isn't any addition for this over the explanation that Jesus really appeared to these people. But that's not the point. It's just explaining the same data. And what makes it a better explanation isn't the fact that we have some additional evidence. It's the fact that it's much more plausible, because I just showed you, and I'm sure like if I spent one additional day, I would have 50 pages about Pareidolia and about its religious significance and about how this is apparently a very ubiquitous feature of human psychology. And on the other hand, it seems to me that Yahweh, if he exists, has a very, very strong proclivity not to raise people from the dead for some reason. I'm probably not going to be raised from the dead, right? At least not before the eschaton. So yeah. Now, here's an interesting question. Do we have any examples of Pareidolia in the ancient world? Well, in some cases we do, right? So let's take a look at it. Cicero, De Natura Deorum, which is a text that we already talked about. So if you are interested in that, definitely check that stream out. He says 2 sons, which, as I have heard my father say, happened in the consulate of Turitanus and Aquilius. I think that this is like middle of the 2nd century BCE, and in which year also another son was extinguished. These things terrified mankind, and raised in them a firm belief in the existence of some celestial and divine power. So what happened? Two suns appeared in the sky. They terrified mankind, and they raised in them a firm belief in the existence of some celestial and divine power. Sure sounds to me like Pareidolia, right? Sure sounds to me like it had exactly the same kind of effect on people, probably not educated people, that I'm imagining a Pareidolia had on 500 brethren who all saw Pareidolia and became convinced that they saw the risen Jesus with their eyes. Now, educated people knew, even in antiquity, about this phenomena. It's explained, for example, in Meteorology by Aristotle. It's called parhelion, which is a bright spot that appears on one or both sides of the sun. This is how it looks like. Again, a picture taken from Wikipedia. Again, as far as I understand it, and I'm not an expert in this is how it really looks like with the naked eye. So this is just not just an artifact of photographic technology. Here's another example. Now you can already see how, if you are a Christian and you are very gullible, and maybe you happened to be a peasant in first century Galilee, this could strike you as significant, right, religiously, because looks like a cross. But apparently, that happens all the time. We have another example of parhelion from Cicero, in this case from the Republic. Let us first examine, before any one else arrives, this is a dialogue setting, right? What can be the nature of the parhelion or double sun, which was mentioned in the Senate? Why was it mentioned in the Senate? Well, because people were freaking out about it, right? People consider it to be a divine sign from the gods, because they assigned religious significance, these kinds of things. They identified a pattern in nature, and obviously meaningful patterns can only come from minds, right? So must be the gods trying to tell us something, probably something very bad, because unlike Greek gods, the Roman gods did not send any positive signs, they only sent negative signs. So if gods were silent, that meant that everything is okay. And when gods actually started interfering in the world, well, then you knew you're in trouble because you did something wrong. That's something that offended them, and you have to make amends for it. So this is probably why it was mentioned in the Senate. Those that affirm they witnessed this prodigy are neither few nor unworthy of credit, so that there is more reason for investigation than incredulity. Interesting, right? And for a lot of these instances of pareidolia, we can't really say for sure whether what's behind those ancient accounts really is pareidolia or not. Why? Well, again, because we can't go back in time, right? But also because there, unlike today, there really were not any skeptics running around in the ancient world fact-checking these kinds of claims, debunking, some of their interpretations. There were some Epicureans, for example, thought that either gods don't exist at all, or they exist but don't actually interfere in human affairs. And as a consequence of that belief, they had to come up with alternative explanations for all the things that gods were normally invoked as an explanation for. They had to come up with an explanation for why we have laws, languages, technology, agriculture, because all of those things in like traditional Greco-Roman thought we have because we were given them by gods or demigods, right? And one of the things that they had to come up with is an explanation for all of these prodigies, for things in nature that were taken to be signs by the gods, including, for example, instances of pareidolia. But yeah, this was like one of the very few examples of what we could call skeptics in our today's framework, right? It's actually really interesting that Epicureans didn't do it because they had like a proper epistemology. They just did it because they subscribed to like a different set of essentially theological beliefs. And what's skepticism just happened to be what followed like necessarily from the set of theological beliefs which they adopted, right? So there were people like that, but very few, which means that we only really have candidates of Pareidolia. We have texts from the ancient world that we can point to, which could be explained as instances of Pareidolia. They look like really good candidates, but we will never know, right? Because nobody investigated it, we just don't have any evidence. But I think it's still interesting, and I think that there being at least candidate examples of Pareidolia further increases the plausibility of my explanation, because that's what you would expect, right? If it's really the case that people were experiencing Pareidolia just like we do every day today, and if it was the case that Pareidolia had religious significance in like the superstitious thinking of people 2000 years ago, just like it does in people today, you know, we would expect there to be traces of that in ancient literature of essentially candidates for Pareidolia. And this is not unique, by the way. I recently read a book about Roman history, and there was a really interesting point made that I've never heard before. So apparently, if you compare descriptions of these divine signs, which were observed supposedly specifically in Italy, to other parts of the Mediterranean, you notice a really interesting thing. These divine signs in Italy are much more often explicable as products of volcanic activity. So the idea is that there are actual events, like actual occurrences, actual phenomena behind those divine prodigies. They are not just made up, at least not all of them. It's just people misinterpreted volcanic activity as being, or products of volcanic activity as being divine signs, right? And that's what accounts for the regional differences, because Italy, the region of Italy is much more volcanically active than some other parts of the world, right? You know, you have Mount Etna, which I hear now is again being active. Of course, Mount Vesuvius, right, is in Italy. So that's an example of when a volcano became very active in that region. What I am talking about are things like blood rain, for example. So in in Roman sources, I think Tacitus probably, Livy definitely. One of the prodigies, one of the divine omens, is blood raining, and you can very easily explain it by just normal rain mixed with volcanic ash, which gives it red color. Another example is rocks falling from the sky, specifically like rocks raining from the sky. So it's not like an asteroid, for example, which they were known in antiquity. So people like were finding asteroids and they knew that like this is a stone that came from heaven, you know. No, this is just like rain, but instead of droplets of water, it's actually rocks. So like looks supernatural, right? But actually, you know, if you have a volcano nearby, then that could happen, or at least it's could be like a core of a story which is later exaggerated. So this is something that historians posit as an explanation for some of these divine prodigies, you know. And of course, these historians are writing about Roman history. They have nothing to do with the Bible, with with Christianity, with theological debates. So I don't think they are biased. You know, they are definitely not biased for or against there being Roman gods. I don't think. So if that works for volcanic activity as a potential explanation, why not Pareidolia? You know. So what are some of the candidates? Let's turn to ancient sources, right? So Josephus' Jewish War. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 1 and 20th day of the month Artemisius, which I think is in spring, March, I think, or April, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those who saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running around among the clouds and surrounding of cities. Well, do I think that actually happened? No, of course not, right? I don't think that if we traveled to the first, to whatever the period of time that's supposed to be in, I'm not actually exactly sure. Probably first century, right? Given that's in the Jewish War, I don't think we would be able to find people who like would honestly say, "Yeah, I saw armies running around the skies." Right? What seems to me probably the case is that people observed an instance of pareidolia, and then that information got exaggerated into this. But it's a celestial phenomena essentially that people assigned religious significance. And by the way, this is a total aside, but just observe how Josephus is reporting this. Right? It's really interesting to mention because here we have a ancient historian who writes ancient historiography, and he's following conventions of ancient historiographical works. So if, for example, the canonical Gospels were historiographical works as well, if they were in the same genre, we would expect them to report these kind of things like this, right? So look at what he says. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable, were it not related by those who saw it. Can you point me to where in the Gospels it says anything like that? Does it say in the Gospel of Mark? Does the author in the Gospels ever express this kind of, does he ever reflect on the events this kind of way? Does he say, for example, I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable? No, right? It really makes you think. Okay, then we have a whole bunch of examples from Titus Livius, from Livy, who is really reports divine omens all the time, right? So he says, and it's actually really interesting because we have history, and then on the same page you are going to have descriptions of these amazing supernatural events. So that's a thing that we have to deal with as like people who study ancient history. So he says, during the winter, many portents occurred in Rome and the neighborhood, or at all events, many were reported and easily gained credence. For when once men's minds have been excited by superstitious fears, they easily believe these things. So again, here we have an ancient historian not only expressing at least some skepticism, but also commenting on how superstitious and gullible people were back then, and how they were primed to believe all kinds of theological claims. Because it's just fit into their existing worldview. They were oversensitive agency detectors and stuff like that. So and then in several, actually in many places, there are lists of these prodigies, right? And a lot of them are actually celestial phenomena, which I think again can be very easily explained as there being an instance of pareidolia behind them. And then of course they were exaggerated. So a phantom navy was seen shining in the sky. So do I think there actually was a phantom navy and that's what people saw? Probably not, right? But hey, could be pareidolia that then got exaggerated. Arpai, shields had been seen in the sky and the sun had appeared to be fighting with the moon. Like I would really love to see that. That sounds like amazing anime. So if you have an anime where the sun fights with the moon, I want to see it. At Hadria, that an altar with appearances of men surrounding it in white clothing was seen in the heavens. So this isn't actually like that far-fetched, right? Because you can just think of, I don't have the examples prepared, but just think of some of the pictures of specifically of Jesus that I showed before. Now I can totally see someone looking up in the skies and seeing something that kind of looks like an altar, which would essentially be just a box, right? If you look at it, and there being kind of two figures on either side, right? I can definitely see that. And that's exactly the kind of thing that would trigger people into believing that this is a divine sign. A lot of these signs were actually recorded during the Second Punic War, when the Rome was in big trouble, right? Because Hannibal was in Italy, and Roman armies, like entire Roman armies, were actually being wiped out left and right, with almost no survivors. And yeah, that was like one of the periods in time when the Roman Empire, the Roman state, was the closest to it being destroyed. And if very specific people in very specific circumstances made slightly different decisions, then like literally the entire world history would go differently, because Carthage would conquer Rome, and the butterfly effect would start. And what the reason why I'm saying that is because in the period of the Second Punic War, I think the Romans were like super susceptible to super receptive to these kinds of prodigies, to these, like, they were looking for these kinds of omens. They are more likely, they were expecting them most because the state was in danger. And of course, the Romans are strong and mighty, not because of their own accomplishments. It's because they are the most pious, and that's why the gods chose them to rule the world. This was the Roman mentality. Like, we are successful because we have a contractual relationship with the gods, who, in exchange for our sacrifices and our festivals, grant us victory. Now, obviously, what happens when you start losing? Well, it must be because you angered the gods. It must be because there is discord between you and the gods. You are no longer in the right standing with the gods. You don't know what you did wrong, obviously, but you did something wrong. And that's why, there are Carthaginian armies in Italy that are defeating you, repeatedly, and your state is on the verge of collapse, and you have to arm slaves to fight in your new legions. So yeah, the people were much more susceptible in that specific circumstance to look for these kinds of events, I think. And we actually see the Roman Senate during the Second Punic War actually bringing up and instituting all kinds of crazy and super obscure rituals from like deep, dark Roman history that were really not, were almost forgotten, right? Because you can see, like, the state is falling apart. It's obviously because the gods are angry. So you can see the priests, Pontifex Maximus and the augurs scrambling around looking for anything, like for any way how to appease the gods, because they didn't know why the gods are angry and they didn't necessarily know what to do with it, right? So they were just essentially throwing shit at the wall to see if it sticks. And after, all of the usual ways of appeasing the gods, they have to come up with maybe it's this old ritual that we stopped doing 200 years ago that will appease the gods, right? Well, one of the things, for example, that they decreed is Lectesterium, which is a very old ritual. I think it's Etruscan, where you take statues of gods from the temple, you clothe them in like super luxurious clothing, you put them on seats, and you prepare a feast for them, for the statues, essentially. And you participate in that feast. And it's essentially an expression of you as a community having like a super close personal relationship with the gods, because you are literally dining together. And obviously in Mediterranean culture, where people are much more social, these gatherings are much more important, you actually dining with the gods as your equals is like the closest that you as a person can get to them, right? That's the mentality, that's the symbolism behind the ritual. And for whatever reason, that ritual came into disuse. But during the Second Punic War, it was actually reinstituted because Romans were just looking for what's wrong and how to fix it. And I think this is at least a little bit comparable to the situations that the disciples of Jesus were in after Jesus died. I think they were much more susceptible to these kinds of phenomena. And by the way, this is something that I didn't say and I should have probably said. I think on my explanation, the disciples, where at least some of them, already believed that Jesus was raised from the dead, that he ascended into heaven, he ascended to the heavens, and that he is right now sitting or standing on the right hand side of God. And the reason why they believe that is because that's what the Old Testament says, right? They were able to find an exegesis of various Old Testament passages that allowed them to make sense of why Jesus was killed. Specifically, they linked the figure of the Messiah, who is killed, with the suffering servant in Isaiah, who is also killed. And actually, if you read that passage, Shearson's like someone who, goes through trial and is like stricken and spat upon and stuff like that, So yeah, I think, like, on my explanation, the belief in Jesus' resurrection and ascension actually is chronologically prior to any experiences that any people had. So I think any experiences were only confirmatory. So people didn't actually form new beliefs because of them. It just basically sealed the deal. Like, it was the last nail in the coffin. It was the last straw that broke camel's back, right? They already believed that Jesus was raised and that he ascended to heaven, and it just sealed the deal. So yeah, but I mean, if there were no appearances, if there were no phenomena that people interpreted as experiences of being the risen Jesus, nothing really would change about history of Christianity. There would still be disciples who believed that Jesus was raised from the dead because of their interpretation of the Old Testament. They would convert other people, and the rest is history. So yeah, that's worth mentioning. Super interesting example is the conversion of Constantine. I definitely want to do a separate live stream just on the conversion of Constantine, because there is a lot to unpack. But let's just look at this. And while he, Constantine, was thus praying with fervent entreaty, I want to say, a most marvelous sign appeared to him from heaven, the account of which it might have been hard to believe had it been related by any other person. But since the victorious emperor himself long afterwards declaring to the writer of this history, Eusebius, when he was honored with his acquaintance and society, and confirmed his statement by an oath, who could hesitate to credit this relation, especially since the testimony of aftertime has established its truth? So again, just an aside, right? Just to digress. Eusebius is a historian. He's an ancient historian. He writes historiography. Just look at what he says, right? He says, the account of which it might have been hard to believe had it been related by any other person. So if it was someone else, it would be crazy. Then he says this, but since the victorious emperor himself, so Constantine himself, declared it to the writer of his history, Eusebius. Eusebius here is saying that actually the source of information for the claim is an eyewitness. It's Constantine. Eusebius essentially says, look, Constantine. So this would be hard to believe, but actually Constantine told this to me personally, and I'm writing it down, right? And he says, when he, meaning Eusebius, me essentially, he's writing about himself in the third person, was honored with his acquaintance and society, and confirmed this by the statement of oath. So what Eusebius is saying, that the information about the appearance not only comes from an eyewitness, Constantine, but it's actually an eyewitness that Eusebius as the author himself talked to, and the eyewitness even confirmed it by an oath. And if it was anyone else, this would be like super insane, right? Just listen and think about how ancient historiographers wrote their works. If they have eyewitness testimony, they say that they have eyewitness testimony. They are getting their information from eyewitnesses. Why wouldn't they? This is a Christian historiographer, right? Not a Greek or Roman. He was a Greek, but not a pagan historian. I think if the Gospels were really historiographical, and if there was eyewitness testimony behind them, this is how they would look like. This is how Christian historiography looks like, right? From the ancient world. It would say, what I'm going to describe, Mark, what I'm going to describe now, sounds crazy, but actually I got that information from Peter, the apostle himself. He wouldn't probably take an oath, right? Because it was kind of yikesy for Christians to take oaths. But yeah, that's the point, right? So what was the experience actually? He said that about noon, When the day was already beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun, and bearing the inscription, "Conquer by this." At this sight, he himself was struck with amazement, and his whole army also, which followed him on this expedition, and witnessed the miracle. So here we actually have an entire army witnessing a miracle. So this is not just one person. This is actually a situation which is like comparable to the appearance to the 500 brethren, right? So we are seeing a large group of people witnessing something with their own eyes, right? And we have it from an eyewitness that we, can actually name because the author of the account actually gives the name in the account, right? He indicates like what his eyewitness source is. Now, do I think that this actually happened? Do I think that an entire army saw a cross of light in heavens with an inscription, "Conquer by this," right? This is exactly the kind of thing that atheists are asking for, like if the stars rearrange themselves, if the other side of the moon spell out, Jesus is God, that would be amazing evidence. But of course, that would take away the free will from people, right? So apparently an entire Roman army had their free will taken away by God spelling out, probably in Greek or in Latin alphabet, this inscription. Do I think this actually happened? Of course not, because you have to realize that we are talking about Eusebius living in the 4th century or in the 4th century. So these are not some like Christians who are running away from the state, constantly being at risk of being exposed and martyred. No, Constantine is the emperor. Eusebius is writing imperial propaganda, right? So this is no different than Horace writing that God Mercury became incarnate on earth in the person of Caesar Augustus, or Vergilius writing how the soul of Caesar, Julius Caesar, ascended to heaven in a form of a comet. I think we can all recognize that, right? Like even if you think that the martyrdom argument is really good, and that nobody would die for a lie, and that the gospel authors were essentially truthful, I think you would concede that when the emperor is a Christian, there are obvious political interests in producing these kinds of narratives, right? But again, there could be some grain of truth behind it. I can definitely see, for example, an entire army seeing a Parhelion, for example. And that is actually an interesting movie. It's called Constantine and the Cross, something like that. And it actually describes this. It actually depicts this. So let me see if I'll be able to play it. Let's play it without the sound. Because I think they actually depicted it really well. I'm not sure if I actually didn't see the movie. I was just told that there is the scene, and I think it works as a really good illustration of what I'm trying to say. Without the sound, and here we go. So what's the situation, right? It's early 4th century, just before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where Constantine cemented his claim to imperial power, and he apparently saw a vision of the cross in heavens. And this is how, like a random movie from 60s, Italian movie, decided to depict it. This is Constantine. Yeah, there you go. Nice, right? I can see something like that happening, like that's not out of the realm of possibility. Yeah, what do you think? Yeah, okay. So what do we have next? Yeah, so let's get specifically to Christianity. Because we have, of course, celestial phenomena being tied specifically to early Christianity and Second Temple Judaism as well. So we can go through some examples. So I was kind of praising the plausibility, showing that the plausibility of that explanation is high by, first of all, talking about how this is a thing that obviously happens to people all the time, how it's a thing in specifically religious contexts. I was raising the plausibility by showing candidates from the ancient world, Greek and Roman world specifically, where this could be a really good explanation. And now we can go to ancient Jewish and early Christian literature to show that, again, it's plausible. You can kind of see the kinds of people, like Jesus's disciples, assigning religious significance to the kind of experience or the kind of phenomena that I'm describing. So as we all know, the vision of the Messiah, specifically being clouded, being in the sky in the clouds, is nothing new. So Daniel 7:13, I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. Now, of course, this is talking about a son of man, which is just a guy, right? But it's usually interpreted as being a highly exalted figure, supernatural, divine figure. And there are actually Christian apologists who argue that the connection between the Son of Man and the Messiah was already made in before Christianity started in second Jewish literature, because there are some texts where this connection is being made. For example, First Enoch, or I think for Fourth Ezra. But the problem is that these texts, at least the version that we have today, is relatively late, and they have super complicated textual history, and it's very difficult to tell which parts are later Christian additions and which parts can actually be dated to pre-Christian version of the text. But hey, for example, Mike Lacona thinks that, so I'm going to take this, right? So someone like Jesus' disciples would believe that this is actually talking about the Messiah. So here we have the Messiah specifically being depicted as there in heaven in the clouds. Then, of course, we have Peter in Acts 2, in his speech during the first public proclamation of the resurrection, where he quotes a Old Testament prophet Joel, who talks specifically about celestial phenomena and a list of prodigies, divine omens, which signify important apocalyptic events that the author of Acts is using in the speech of Peter to as indications that the Old Testament prophecies are now coming true. And I will show portents in the heavens above, and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. So we can clearly see that Second Temple Jews assigned religious significance to celestial phenomena, just like pagans did, right? This is not unique to Greeks, Romans, and other cultures. And I'm sure we would be able to pull more examples from the Old Testament. A little bit later in Acts, Stephen is stoned, of course, and before he dies, he sees what? A vision of Jesus in the clouds, in heavens. And when they heard these things, they became enraged and ground their teeth at Stephen. I would love to see that in a movie. Is there a movie that depicts that? How does it look like? Something like that? Yeah, maybe something like that. Yeah? Yeah, okay. But filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And I'm going to say that right now. I think this passage in the book of Acts, which is otherwise mostly historically unreliable, is a kernel of historical truth. It's a nugget of historical truth, because there is a reminiscent in that passage to that Pareidolia experience that the 500 people and Cephas and James and the apostles experienced. It was transferred which was a common ancient literary technique, don't you know? Transferal. Read a book, specifically by Michael Acuna about it, right? It was transferred to a different person, to Stephen, to a different setting. But I'm claiming that there is actually a kernel of truth behind it. Yeah, I'm just being facetious, of course. But I think, it does raise the plausibility. You can say that, like, how people who are already, because you can very easily imagine a civilization that just doesn't have these kinds of features in their literature, right? That just doesn't ascribe significance to these kinds of phenomena. And I think if the New Testament was produced in that culture, the way that we have it today, the plausibility of my hypothesis would be much, much lower, actually. Because, yeah, there wouldn't be any precedent for that. And we would be able to show from like the remains of that civilization that this was something super weird. It was something super unusual. But in actuality, yeah, in these ancient cultures, these kinds of phenomena were considered important, religiously important, and they were apparently taking place all the time, right? And being interpreted and being used into religious thinking of these people all the time. So yeah, which just makes it much more plausible, I think definitely much more plausible than an actual resurrection. And that's true even if there's Yahweh, because, as we all know, he has a very strong proclivity against raising people from the dead in general. And all of the reasons for thinking that he made an exception with Jesus are either circular, ad hoc, non sequiturs. They raise the plausibility, but they actually also raise plausibility of my explanation as well, or they just kick the plausibility bucket down the road. And we are going to have probably more than one stream about that specifically at some point. Okay, what do we have next? Yeah, this is super interesting, right? So now we are really zooming in on the figure of the Messiah, because of course, specifically the Messiah was associated with celestial phenomena. So in the Book of Revelation, Jesus is specifically identified. He actually identifies himself as the bright morning star, and seems kind of random, right? Because it's the Book of Revelation, so of course it just looks like an acid trip. But actually, like people who think that like the Book of Revelation is actually just dumb or it's just a full of nonsense, completely fail to appreciate the genius of the author, because it's full of meaning. And if you dismiss it, because you think that it's just superstition and it's not worth thinking about, it's not worth reading, then you are actually missing out on a lot of artistic, literary value that's in it. And if you are a Christian, which you think that this is just describing events as they will transpire, then of course you are missing on that as well, right? Because that's not the point of the text. So again, this is something that's very important in the Book of Revelation, and it's not just some random stuff. There is an entire history behind it, right? So here's a commentary on the Book of Revelation, which points out that the root of David is obviously Messianic. The morning star recalls the oracle of Balaam, who said that a star would rise from Jacob to rule the nations. This is from Numbers. I didn't pull the specific passages because I thought it would be more interesting to show the commentary, but you can obviously just later pause the video and look up those passages. Jewish sources took the star to be a messianic figure. So the idea that the Messiah is associated with some kind of celestial phenomena is already there in Second Temple literature, in the Testament of Levi, Testament of Judah. In CD, which is it's the Damascus scroll, it's one of the scrolls in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. The star is the interpreter of the law, and his scepter is a royal figure. But in 1QM, the star defeats Israel's foes. Here, Revelation follows the Messianic interpretation by identifying Jesus as a star. And here is actually super interesting point about the broader, Greco-Roman context. By way of contrast, a comet or star was said to have appeared after Julius Caesar's death, signifying his deification. The star was pictured on imperial coins, and the symbol was bequeathed to Augustus and Tiberius, who shared imperial rule. And here we have a number of sources: Horace, Valerius Maximus. Yeah. Uh, in Revelation, Christ is the legitimate ruler who grants the followers a share of his reign, signified by a star. So again, not exactly identical to what I'm proposing, right? Here it's a star; it's not a cloud, but it's a celestial phenomena. So it shows that people are looking at the sky, thinking about these kinds of things, and if they saw something weird, like a comet or a shape, a cloud of an interesting shape, this sparked their religious thinking. So yeah, and the last thing that I want to play is a clip which shows how not to respond to this hypothesis. A while ago, actually, I think it might be more than a year ago, Cameron from Capturing Christianity did a Q&A session with Dr. Gary Habermas about, but just like in general, like Habermas, it's everyone's favorite teddy bear, right? So you can ask him about the Shout of Turin, you can ask him about NDEs, gonna have amazing time. And someone actually brought up this specific explanation, and he credited me because, to my knowledge, I'm the first person who came up with this. Right? I'm not aware of anyone proposing this in literature, and it would be actually super exciting if this took up and actually became a thing that scholars have to respond to and think about. So he credited me as the author of this hypothesis, and he wanted Habermas to respond to it. Now, I'm not going to blame Habermas for the way he responded, because I think I'm almost 100% certain that that was the first time he heard about it. So he was given zero context. He had no information to work with, right? Obviously, it was a question submitted in a form super chat, I think. So there is very limited space. You can't flesh the argument out. You can't point how it actually exactly works. What are the reasons for thinking it's a plausible explanation? So I wouldn't expect anyone else in Habermas's position to do any better, right? Like I'm not going to I'm going to criticize the response. I'm going to talk about why I think it's not like a good way how to respond to it. But I really don't mean any like ill will against Habermas specifically, because yeah, like it just was a random thing that somehow threw at him during like a YouTube stream, right? I hope you guys will be able to hear it. So here we go. What's in 1.9? Because I don't know. Again, that obviously has nothing to do with what I'm saying, right? It's just Jesus's. Oh, sorry. That's just Jesus's ascension, right? And when he had said this, they were watching as he lifted up, and cloud took him out of their sight. Oh, there you go. We have another interesting connection with the cloud, right? But this is like this has nothing to do with my explanation, right? So Habermas laughs. Again, like if this is the context that you're given, that's a really appropriate response, I think. Not going to fault him for that. But this is how he responds. Yeah, so I need to clarify this. This just shows you how unreliable oral tradition is, right? So be very careful with oral tradition. So even though we are living in the information age of universal literacy, where you have the entire internet at your fingertips and you can very easily fact check information, people still just distort information all the time, right? Like imagine how much worse that would be in first century where all you have is word of mouth. So yeah, I'm not working on my PhD. I do have a PhD already, but it's not in any relevant field. I am doing an undergraduate program in ancient history and ancient Greek philology. So if I ever get a PhD in that, which I would really hope, I hope I will be able to do that, I'm not going to be a New Testament scholar. I will try to focus on history of early Christianity because I think it's a really interesting area of ancient history. But yeah, I'm not going to have education in biblical studies, not going to have education in theology. Okay, you guys can't hear it. Okay, never mind then. Shall we do that with like shall we do that with the subtitles? Fuck it. Let's not do it. I'm going to post the link to that in the stream, to the video description of the stream, and you can take a look at it later. But yeah, the point is basically that this is a typical yellow brick road apologetics, right? So the way how Habermas responds is if Jesus, well, if the disciples became convinced that Jesus rose from the dead because they saw a cloud, then how do you explain them believing that they were taught by Jesus for 40 days? Like a cloud can't do that, Like you seeing a cloud is not going to trigger you having experience of a dead person being alive and hanging around talking to you for 40 days. That's silly. I agree. That's not the point. I'm not explaining the contents of that passage as a cloud, right? I just think this is something that maybe the author of Acts made up for theological reasons. Maybe his source, whoever that might be, made it up. I don't know. I don't think we will ever know. But that's not the point, right? We're just describing, we're just explaining the content of the First Corinthians 15 creed. So we have to only take in the details from the First Corinthians 15 creed, and that doesn't talk about Jesus teaching his disciples for 40 days. It doesn't talk about anyone seeing Jesus eat a piece of fish. It doesn't talk about anyone fingering Jesus's holes, right? It doesn't talk about Jesus appearing in a closed room to a group of people. It just talks about a large group of Christians who saw Jesus. Could be Pareidolia. Why not? And again, is this completely silly? Of course it is. Do I really believe it? Of course not. Is this more probable than an actual resurrection? Yes. And it's still true, even if Yahweh actually exists. Because if he exists, it seems to me he has a really, really strong tendency not to raise people from the dead. In fact, I can make very, very, very confident predictions about what Yahweh is going to do in the future based on past experience with what he tends to do. I have this cup. This is my signature cup. And if I place it on my table, I can predict that until the stream ends, Yahweh is not going to choose to cause a miracle and send that cup flying across the room. Just think about it, right? Now making a prediction about what the creator of the universe is going to do. It sounds extremely ballsy, but it's actually super easy, barely an inconvenience, because we're just working with past knowledge, about what kinds of things Yahweh does and doesn't do. So that's actually not very difficult to get that right. Similarly, we can make predictions about big people being raised from the dead. And of course, if you are a Christian, you are going to be screaming, at least internally, maybe even externally, at your screen, that no, we are talking about Jesus and not just some other guy. But that's a question for another stream. So, questions, comments. I see we have Paulogia in the live chat, which is super exciting. Yeah, I would love to obviously have a chat with him because, yeah, I don't know, like what kind of explanation would he propose, for example, for the content of the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed? Does Paul think that there were no people that probably that the creed is talking about, that the reason why we have the creed is because there was false information essentially that got associated in the creed? Or does he think that there probably were some people, but maybe they experience some kind of charismatic stuff, right? Like what Pentecostals experience apparently every Sunday, you know. So we have questions. If the belief of the resurrection was before the experience, how would you explain the third day of 1 Corinthians 15? Yeah, sure. So Jesus died. Sometime after he died, could be days, weeks, months, years. Some Christians, some of his disciples, went through the Old Testament and they were able to put together an explanation of why the Messiah had to be killed. And they utilized various passages, which they became convinced actually talk about Jesus. They actually talked about Jesus all this time, right? And in fact, the hidden meaning was hidden from people, and it only became apparent for them then. We have examples of this all the time in Second Temple Jewish literature. In fact, this is predominantly what the Jews at the period of time did with their sacred scriptures. They were actually looking for ways how what it says is still meaningful for them in their own time. If we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, when you look at commentaries to the prophetic books, it will just copy what a book, an Old Testament book, the book from the Hebrew Bible, says about some random stuff, right? What Prophet Nahum or Habakkuk say. And then it will say, this means, and it will start talking about Demetrius, the Seleucid king, right? Demetrius II. So yeah, Second Temple Jews were looking through the old. And by the way, the connection between what Demetrius did actually in history and what Habakkuk wrote or Nahum wrote is going to be extremely weak. And you reading that today you're going to be thinking there is no way this like anyone would see that connection between what the Bible says and what actually took place in 2nd century BCE with Demetrius II, right? But apparently, the Essenes in that community saw those kinds of connections, right? So this is what I'm proposing, right? So the disciples came up with an exegesis of the Old Testament that employed various passages, and they explained away why is it the case that the Messiah had to die. They became convinced of it. They became convinced that, you know, the suffering servant who was the Messiah was raised, lifted up, and highly exalted in heaven, and that he's in fact now in heaven at the right-hand side of God's celestial throne. And obviously the 3 days comes from the Old Testament as well, from a couple of places, for example, from the story about Jonah. And later, months, years, we don't know, they experienced Pareidolia, and this just cemented their belief. All right. So Paulogia is apparently up for a chat, which is amazing. So I will make sure to schedule an interview. Cool. Oral tradition is worse when it's muted. No sound playing. Yeah, sorry about the sound. I have to figure it out. It like on my end, it looks like it's actually playing, but oh well. I don't plan to play a lot of videos. I don't want to be just a channel that comments on apologists giving sermons and stuff like that, because I think, if you want that, go watch Pine Creek. He does that every day now. I just want to take a little bit more time and like prepare some examples from primary sources and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay, so any questions? St. Patrick is another example. He experienced sleep paralysis and was saved by the sunrise. Scott Preston. Yeah, that's really interesting. Like the issue is super interesting how like common this is, because I obviously didn't spend almost any time preparing for it. I just grabbed a couple of examples that I know of because I read the primary sources. But if actually someone was really interested in that, then I wouldn't be surprised that we would be able to come up with much more examples that could be plausibly proposed. Like the kind of phenomena that I'm describing could be very plausibly proposed as an explanation. And like at some point when I do have a PhD, another one, I could write an article about it, how like Pareidolia could be an explanation for this, and people. Oh, by the way, there is actually an entire discipline of retrospective diagnosis in medical literature. I'm right now reading some works of Hippocrates from the Hippocratic corpus for a course that I'm taking on like Greek medicine. And it's actually really interesting that there are like serious peer-reviewed academic articles that try to identify diagnoses, medical diagnoses of people based on the description of symptoms in the Hippocratic treatises, right? Because epidemics, for example, contains very detailed descriptions of individuals. So there are casuistics, individual cases, where it describes exactly the kind of symptoms that people had down to individual days. For example, what kind of feces they were excreting, how it looked like, what was the color, like did it smell bad, how bad, and stuff like that. And medical experts today are trying to find out, okay, was this typhus? Was this something else, So I think there's room for it, and we could potentially do it for more kind of mental phenomena, right? Like sleep paralysis and stuff like that. Yeah, there is one interesting point that I didn't make, and it's the possibility that 1 Corinthians 15 didn't even originally set 500 brethren, because it has been pointed out that the word 500 in Greek is similar to the word Pentecost. I don't like. I personally I'm kind of meh about it. It could be the case, but I don't know. It's definitely you don't have to. It's another possibility that's on the table, but you don't have to like stick to it as being the explanation, because you can do much better. You can just grant it for the sake of argument and say that it was Pareidolia. Yeah. Scott Preston. Yeah, I wanted to make it. I wanted to mention it, but then I decided to cut it for space. Yeah, that passage from Josephus, where it talks about chariots in heavens and stuff like that. What immediately follows after that actually is the account of Jesus ben Ananias, which of course has all kinds of interesting connections. How Jesus is portrayed in the gospel. Yeah. Mount Cassius Zaphon is a natural gathering place of thunderstones. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so shall we do an after show on Discord? Let's do an after show on Discord. Let's see how many people show up. We have 40 viewers. So if you want to talk to me, if you want to tell me how stupid this is, let's head to Discord. I will just do my usual shtick, which is something completely different. And there's a question by Kasper. The cross-shaped molecule, you got it from Podholer 54, right? I think so. I think I saw it like 10 years ago, maybe for the first time, so probably from him. By the way, if you don't know who Podholer is, one of the best YouTube channels probably still, right? He used to do, he's a science communicator. He used to do creationist videos, like debunking creationist arguments. And now he shifted to climate science, which is like super important, definitely much more important than anything that I'm doing with this channel and with my life in general. I was actually thinking about like when I graduated, what I wanted to do with my life, and one of the things that I was considering is becoming a climate activist because, yeah, that's like probably the biggest problem that people are facing in general right now, I would say, and it's not going to get any better. But I decided to have like a small YouTube channel talking about things that almost nobody cares about. So there we go. So if we go extinct in the next like 100 years because of climate change, I guess that's on me. So yeah, now for something completely different, and then we had on Discord. So this time I actually didn't prepare anything from the primary sources. I want to tell you about an amazing archaeological discovery that took place very recently. It's super exciting because you don't actually get to see textbooks on ancient history being rewritten so much in your lifetime. So what I'm going to be talking about is not a discovery that would be on par with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It wouldn't be on par with the discovery of the Epicurean library in Herculaneum that was covered by during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Not going to be talking, of course, about anything comparable to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But recently, there was a discovery made in ancient history, which is very significant. It's also significant, for example, for specifically our history of Czech people and Slavic people in general, right? So it actually turned out that the Slavic people, used writing about 200 or 300 years before we thought they did, or at least before we had evidence to show. So up until recently, we thought that the Slavic people, so the ancestors of Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Prussians, Ukrainians, Croats, right, Macedonians, even, that their ancestors didn't use writing, or at least we didn't have any evidence for it. And actually, the first alphabet that was introduced in the 9th century CE from Byzantine Empire by two monks. And the situation was basically that in the 9th century in Central Europe, there was a realm, essentially a feudal realm, an empire, a small empire called Great Moravia, which is in today's Czech Republic and Slovakia, the territorial extent. It was somewhat important, somewhat a regional power, and they were interested in adopting Christianity because that's what these like Eastern European rulers were doing back then. And they tried to adopt it from the West. So they adopted Latin prayer and Latin church service, but it didn't work out, probably for political reasons. So eventually one of the rulers, Svatopluk, sent a letter to Constantinople, to the Byzantine emperor at the time, requesting him to introduce Eastern Orthodox Christianity to Great Moravia, right? And the Byzantine emperor sent two monks named Cyril and Methodius, who essentially brought a Greek alphabet, and they modified it for Slavic languages, because of course in Slavic languages there are certain sounds that don't exist in Greek, so there are no Greek letters, or there were no Greek letters to express them. Maybe sounds like r, ny, d, sh, and so on. I don't know how like Proto-Slavic sounded like, so maybe those are not very good examples. The Cyrillic, named after Cyril, looks like this. This is how it looked like, and you can kind of see some Greek characters from the alphabet, right? Greek alphabet: alpha, beta, gamma, delta, eta, iota, kappa, mini. Yeah, there's a lot of them. But then, especially towards the end, that doesn't sound familiar to me because we are, of course, using Latin alphabet. Maybe if you know Russian or Ukrainian, that's going to be more familiar. But I guess those would be the letters that were added specifically for the sounds that the Greek language doesn't have. So that was the story up until a couple of weeks ago, I guess, or maybe a couple of months ago. But then an archaeological found was made in the territory of today's Czech Republic of a cattle bone with runes on it. And this now is the oldest evidenced instance of the Slavic people using runes, especially and more broadly using any kind of writing system at all. It's dated to about 600 CE, so that pushes the clock about 200 years back. Apparently, scholars kind of expected that this is probably going to be the case, that, sooner or later, maybe we will find some evidence for it, but now it was actually found, and it's official. I don't think that we know what it says. At least I wasn't able to find any translation of it. But there you go, right? And I don't actually know we would be able to translate it because we wouldn't necessarily know what sounds the specific runes were assigned to. But yeah, it's just super exciting. Probably not that exciting for someone in the US, but if you are a Czech, one of the things that you learn in Czech history, so I guess that would be comparable to some like minutia about the American Civil War and the founding of the Republic and writing of the Constitution and stuff like that. One of the factoids that you learn in Czech history classes is, Cyril and Methodius, who brought Greek alphabet to the Slavic people. Now, all of that is going to be rewritten because actually the earliest evidence of Slavic people using writing, not just Czechs, but Slavic people anywhere in Eastern Europe, is from 600 CE, roughly, and it's runes. And actually, it's super interesting because technically speaking, Cyril and Methodius were two monks who came to. We are actually celebrating one of the biggest festivals, one of the biggest, most important days, which is being commemorated in Czech Republic and even more significant in Slovakia today, is the occasion of them coming to Great Moravia because they brought writing, they brought religion and stuff like that. So is the national myth, right? But actually, if you think about it, they were just two guys who came to country that no longer exists. They brought an alphabet that nobody uses and a religion that nobody believes. Definitely not here, right? And they are, of course, saints in Roman Catholicism, even though they were Eastern Orthodox. I think they are saints at least, right? But it's definitely the Roman Catholic Church that celebrates them, even though technically they were heretics because they were not Roman Catholic, they were Eastern Orthodox, right? But now that I think about it, maybe now, like in ecclesiastical times, like the Eastern Orthodoxy and the Roman Catholic Church are like more okay, so they would recognize each other as being based. So yeah, that's really interesting. So let me drop the link for the Discord chat, and I'll see you guys there. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope I will be able to stream much more often in the future. To be honest, it doesn't look good because now I'm basically at the point of my studies when I need to learn how to read in Greek, specifically the original sources. So the sources that are not just it's not examples, sentences from a textbook. They are actual primary sources, right? So we are reading Symposion by Plato. I'm supposed to read Apology, Xenophon, some sections from Herodotus, quite a lot. And over time, probably next year, we will start with reading Homer, and some drama like Euripides or Aeschylus. And I have to say, the learning curve is extremely steep, and it's super important for me to invest a lot of time into it now at the beginning, because if I slack now, it's only going to get worse and worse. So I really have to like invest a lot of time into it now. It's enjoyable, obviously, but it's unfortunately very, very difficult. So yeah, head over to Discord. I will be hanging out for like an hour, let's say. So thanks for your attention and have a nice rest of the day.